Hello and welcome back to Module 2, Lesson 4, Budget, Costs and Expenses. So what will we cover in this lesson? We're going to talk about creating your own budget. We're going to talk about some expenses that you need to consider. We're going to talk about sticking to the basics because that's going to make it more affordable for us getting started with our new business. And we're going to talk about tracking your expenses. Now, these things might sound boring and definitely not the most fun part of starting your business, but it's an important part of making sure it's successful and making sure you've got yourself all set up right and that you're charging the right hourly rates to make sure you're covered. Because as always, we don't want to have any nasty surprises as we get going. Okay, so you're going to want to create a budget for your business. So, what I want you to do is, I'd like you to brainstorm what you think your expenses are going to be. And you'll do this by estimating what you think they're going to be on a monthly or an annual basis. I quite like to work it out on a monthly basis so that you're really clear. I mean, often the bills will come out on a monthly basis if you've got subscriptions and that kind of thing, because that gives you a really clear idea of what your total monthly costs are and how much money you need to bring in to cover those costs and then to actually start making money as well. So I like to put things into a spreadsheet, so I recommend doing that, then adding it all up and seeing what the cost is and compare that with what you think you're going to be able to earn. And then you'll be able to see what the difference is. So whether you're going to be actually making money at all. And then once you've done that, if you're not making money or not making as much money as you would like to be, then have a think about whether all of those expenses that you've put in there are must-haves. Do you have to have the latest iPhone on the best plan, or can you keep your existing phone and get the $40 plan that has adequate minutes and adequate data and that kind of thing? So just try and keep your expenses as low as possible until you're earning enough money to cover the fancy iPhone, unless it's a really must-have item. Um, and then once you've got it all into your spreadsheet, think about, is there anything obvious that's jumping out at you that's missing? And that'll give you a really good idea of whether your rates are enough. So if you're thinking you're going to be doing X hours a month at X dollars an hour, and then once you've worked out your expenses and that comes off the bottom line that you're actually making a lot less money than that, then that more than what you want to, then you might need to think about either increasing your hourly rates to make sure that you are making enough money to cover your expenses, or maybe you need to think about reducing the costs that you're spending. Okay, so I think it's really important to get clear on what your costs are. And sometimes when you haven't been in business before, it's quite hard to think of all of those things. So I wanted to put together a bit of a list because when I had my product business, I didn't always think about all of the costs of actually selling the products. So, for example, I've put on there on the list down here, one of the things I've put on is coffee and lunches. And you might not think that's really an essential thing, but when I was doing markets, when I had the baby business, one of the things that I had to do was to go to, you were there at markets for quite a long time, and I didn't even really think about it that much. But a couple of times I had to buy my lunch while I was there because, I mean, I could have taken a sandwich, but I hadn't really thought about that in advance. So are there things like coffees and lunches? Potentially if you're meeting with clients, it might be that you meet in a cafe and you want to buy coffee. That's an expense that you're going to have to cover. I've jumped to coffee, of course, very important, coffee and lunch over all the other things, but lots of things I've put in there. So any business setup costs that you're going to need to cover and, recoup potentially over time. Because it might be that to set up your business, there's those initial costs of things like talking to an accountant or a lawyer, potentially costs of setting up a legal structure of some point, some kind, but you might not have, you might be able to, borrow that money, for example, or you might have that money in savings, but you actually want to pay that back to your savings later on. So you want to factor that into your expenses. accounting costs, accounting costs, you usually have some form of accounting costs on an ongoing basis, particularly if you have an accountant who does your annual returns. So what's that going to cost you annually? Can you, break that down to a monthly cost and then figure out how much you need to save each month to pay your accountant's bill at the end of the year? Are there any legal costs? There's likely to be some form of legal costs at some point, either at the outset or depending on the kind of business that you've got, there might be some more ongoing ones. So think about that. Insurances, usually again, that's going to be a monthly or annual cost that you want to factor in. You've got your telephone and internet costs that you might need to change. You might need a higher data plan or more minutes or those kind of things if you need to change things. Often that doesn't sort of hugely change. If you're working from home, you've usually already got internet and telephone, but if there's anything you need to do, for example, to upgrade an unreliable internet connection, then you want to factor that in. Stationery, there's always stationery. So, one of the things that I didn't always think of in my costs was things, just some of the basics, like how much printer paper and ink you're going to use. Sometimes if you're, depending on the kind of business you're doing, you might need to do quite a lot of printing, and that's a cost as well. That it doesn't always sort of jump straight to the front of your mind, but any consumables you need to use. If you have any marketing costs, things you want to pay for, it might be things like business cards, websites, any advertising that you want to run, those kind of things. If you have an office space, of course, there'll be a cost for that. Often your office space will just be your dining room table, so there isn't really a cost to that, but think about whether there is anything in that space that you need to pay for. Then other things too, just little things that all add up, things like travel and parking. They can add up quite a lot if you have to go to meetings in the CBD, for example. Parking can be quite expensive. And then things like subscriptions. So you might find that depending on the kind of business that you've got, might be really worth your while having particular subscriptions or memberships that you need to have. You might have a website subscription or an email subscription you need to pay for. So factor in those expenses. And then, of course, I know I've said it about 1 million times, but making sure you're clear on your tax, GST, and any other government levies that you have to pay for your business, because those are often some of the bigger ones and the more scary ones. And the tax department generally doesn't like to wait once you owe them some money. So big expenses, but if you're clear on all of these things at the outset, then you shouldn't have any problems. Okay, so again, wanting to come back to the whole idea of sticking to the basics, because in many, many cases, it's quite simple. Your costs won't be very big. You'll be starting out like I did with your existing laptop, your existing phone, your internet connection, your phone plan that you already are paying for. So you aren't going to have lots of big costs. And so don't stress too much. Be aware, but for a lot of us, there won't be a huge amount of costs to get started. Make sure you don't cost yourself out. So don't try and go for the top of everything at the outset, because you might find that it's too expensive for you even to start your business. So don't go overboard. Keep your startup costs low, keep your expenses low, and just do what you need to do to make it happen. And you can always come back and tweak things later. You can get a better printer, you can get get the fancy subscription and the better iPhone. But if cost is a important factor to you, which usually it is when we're starting our business, then keep it to the basics for as long as you can, and then scale as your income starts to scale. And then I wanted to talk about tracking your expenses as well. And one of the reasons why it's really good to track your expenses is that often when it comes tax time, you can claim certain things back off your expenses. So you want to make sure that you keep all the receipts for your expenses. You want to be able to give all this information to your accountant or use it on your tax return later on. So I find it's quite good to have spreadsheets to keep track of these things. It's also quite helpful too in terms of your expenses, because sometimes the expenses you'll want to be able to pass on to a client, for example, if If the expenses are incurred as part of client work, then sometimes you can on charge those on, like, for example, if a client requires you to courier something or print color copies or something like that, then you keep the receipt, so you can on charge it on to the client and then get that money back. So yeah, I like to keep a spreadsheet of things. If you've got your accounting software, it makes it a little bit easier to keep track of some of these things. So something like Xero enables you to reconcile everything to your bank statements. So it means you can stick your receipts and everything straight against the Xero website or through the app, and it means it's nice and tidy and clean. It also means that you don't have to keep the paper receipts in, but like I've said in another lesson, you can scan your receipts and then keep digital copies of them, so you don't have to keep the paper as well. And it's a good practice to do that, to have them saved by date in a folder, so that if you need them for your accountant, then you've got them. And then the other thing too that I've put in there is tracking income. Again, this is kind of like a personal option. You don't have to track your income, but I find it's quite a nice way of me keeping on top of where I am. I mean, it's, if nothing else, helps you to make sure that you've got enough, you've done enough work that month to cover all the costs that you're going to have going out. But also, it can be quite motivating to see when you've got a spreadsheet of your income coming in. And then if you are doing sort of a fairly basic accounting system, I found it quite good to have a spreadsheet of all of my invoices. So I just kept it in an Excel sheet, pretty simple. I made my invoices in a Word template, and then I put them into an Excel sheet. And in that Excel sheet, I just had a column that said, it was invoice number, client, the hours, the amount, and then I put in whether it was paid or not. So that was good to keep track of, and it meant also I was quite easily able to hand that over to my accountant at the end of the year with all of the invoices, copies of all of the invoices that I'd sent out for my tax to be all calculated through my accountant. So everything that you keep track of, it's generally easier to do at the time, and it's generally easier to do it in little bite-sized chunks rather than getting to the end of the financial year and your accountant's calling you asking for the paperwork, and you have to go back and try and find all the receipts and add up all the invoices. And so just having a good recording system to track all of this stuff and is really helpful. And as I've said, it can be as simple as having a spreadsheet of your expenses, a spreadsheet of your invoices and whether they've been paid, and just keep notes of everything. Because I find that sometimes, for example, if I have I've had a situation where I've had to credit something back, if I've made a mistake and I've had to credit an amount back, then it's much easier if I take a note of it at the time, so then I remember what exactly the circumstances were. So keep track of all of that stuff, and I promise you it will make your life easier down the track when it comes to actually doing tax and that kind of thing. Okay, so action station. So get yourself a piece of paper or start a spreadsheet and keep track of the expenses that you think you're going to have in your business. So reminder, keep it simple, don't go too crazy, but just start to build up a list of the expenses. And then you might like to have a think about whether those are things that you actually need to have, or if they're just nice to haves. And if they're just nice to haves, then you might like to take them off until you've actually got a good amount of income coming into your business. Compare it against how much you think you'll earn, and then you've got that calculation at the bottom line to see if your income exceeds the expenses by as much as you need it to. And if not, you might need to revisit the expenses or increase your hourly rates. And then just a final reminder, It's good to track your income against your expenses and to keep a good paper trail because it's going to make it so much easier down the track when you do your tax return. Okay, so that is the last lesson for this module. So now we're going to move on to the exciting stuff of finding our clients. So can't wait to get into those lessons with you very shortly.